Hello friends, this is Navdeep Singh from Hitbullseye.com. In our previous video lectures, we had discussed about modern Indian history. The topics for today's discussion would be firstly the non-cooperation movement, secondly the Nehru Report, the civil disobedience movement, and lastly the Government of India Act 1935. We have to keep in mind these are all the events that had happened during the intervening period of about 1920s till 1940s. So starting for the first topic of today, that is the non-cooperation movement. Guys, whenever we discuss about any movement, firstly we'll be discussing its causes, then we will discuss its events, and lastly we will discuss the reasons of its subsidence. So about the non-cooperation movement, firstly the causes. The economic situation of the country in the post-war years. We have to remember that this is the period of about 1920s, and in this period the First World War had just ended. So in the post-war period there was a rise in prices of commodities and decrease in production of Indian industries, and an increase in the burden of taxes and rents. So because of the bad economics of the government, the people were feeling repressed. The second reason was that of Rowlatt Act and the resultant martial law in Punjab, which further led to the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. But the ultimate or the immediate cause of non-cooperation movement was the Khilafat wrongs as well as the Punjab wrongs. These Punjab wrongs are the same that we have already discussed, that of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, and people had asked to rectify these wrongs or at least to punish the culprits of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Talking a bit about the Khilafat wrongs. In the ending of World War II, the Britishers had occupied Turkey. The Caliph of Turkey, we must know, is the ultimate Khalifa of the Muslim world. The English had promised Khalifa that he would be given good authority over the lands, but the Britishers had renegated on this agreement, and hence the Muslims in India as well as throughout the world were very angry with the Britishers. So people in India also asked the Britishers to rectify these wrongs or the Khilafat wrongs, and hence these two reasons, that is the Punjab wrongs and the Khilafat wrongs, led to the non-cooperation movement. Talking a bit about the events of the non-cooperation movement. Firstly, non-cooperation as a word itself suggests not to cooperate with anything related to the government itself. So there was a boycott of government schools and colleges, of government law courts, and dispensation of justice through panchayats instead, of governmental legislative councils also, of foreign cloth and use of khadi instead of the foreign cloth, and promoting hand spinning. All this was done just to promote the Indian goods and to demotivate the foreign industry which is coming into India. In the non-cooperation movement, we also had renunciation of government honors and titles, and it was also held by the Congress that this boycott would be the first stage. This next stage would be the civil disobedience, that the people would disobey the government in the next stage. Talking about the reasons of subsidence of the non-cooperation movement. Firstly, there was high government repression. The government was indulging into arresting all the leaders and suppressing the masses for expressing their boycott of foreign goods and law courts or any other governmental activity. And next, it is always difficult to sustain a boycott for a long period of time, because it was also important for the people to take care of their daily needs, which could be done only through those goods which were being boycotted by the people at that point in time. But the most important reason for subsidence of non-cooperation movement was the Chauri Chaura incident. What had happened was that police had picked up certain people who were indulging in boycotting and picketing of foreign goods. People were protesting against this pickup or arrest of people by the police, and suddenly the movement turned violent. What the people did there was that people gherawed the police station and burnt alive 22 policemen inside the police station. They put the whole of the police station on fire. This particular incident was a big mark on Gandhiji's mind. After hearing about the incident, Gandhiji immediately decided that they will not continue with such a violent movement, because if the people become violent, the Britisher or the British government would take up measures which will be much more violent than what the people were indulging into. Hence, after the Chauri Chaura incident, the Congress Working Committee discontinued the non-cooperation movement, or rather withdrew the non-cooperation movement. Our next topic of today is the Nehru Report. Talking a bit about the background of the Nehru Report, Lord Birkenhead had promised, or had rather challenged, the Indian leaders to prepare a constitution or to prepare a system of administration for their own people. Nehruji, to be specific, it was not Jawaharlal Nehru, it was Motilal Nehru. So Motilal Nehru took up this challenge and put forward his own constitution, or lines on which a constitution could be framed. That was called the Nehru Report. So we'll discuss about certain features or main features of the Nehru Report here. Firstly, dominion status on lines of self-governing dominions as the form of government desired by the Indians. Secondly, provinces based upon languages would be drawn up. Next was a clear-cut rejection of separate electorates. What is separate electorate? Separate electorates was a system of electing candidates by which only Hindus would be voting for Hindu candidate, Muslims would be voting for Muslim candidate, and other minorities would be voting for their own minority candidates. This is very much in contrast to the joint electorate system as we have in our country as of today. So Nehru Report also rejected this separate electorate, which had been the basis of constitutional reform so far. Instead of these separate electorates, a demand for joint electorate was made for the country. Next was that 19 fundamental rights were included, which also included rights such as rights for women, rights to form unions, and universal adult suffrage. A responsible government at the center and in the province was provided for, a provision was provided for in the Nehru Report itself. And complete dissociation of the state from religion itself was sought after in the Nehru Report. After the Nehru Report, the people got enlightened about certain things such as fundamental rights, certain things such as separation of state from religion, and people started demanding more and more rights and more constitutional reforms from the government. To put forward their demand in a consolidated form, Gandhiji provided and Gandhiji wanted 7 demands from the Britishers. These were issues of general interests such as reducing the expenditure on army and civil services by 50%, total prohibition, reforms in the investigation department, change in Arms Act, release political prisoners, and others. There were also specific bourgeois demands such as reducing rupee sterling exchange rate, which would be beneficial for the Indian exporters, introduce textile protection, the protection for textile mills in the country, and to reserve coastal shipping for Indians. And lastly, there were certain specific peasant demands such as to reduce land revenue by 50%, abolish salt tax, and others. Since the government had declined to follow Gandhiji's 11 demands, the Congress in its meeting decided to put forward a civil disobedience movement for the people. So talking about the events of civil disobedience movement, the causes were the same of Gandhiji's 11 demands and its subsequent rejection. The events of civil disobedience movement were as such. Firstly, we'll discuss the spread of the movement. In Peshawar, a very famous freedom fighter by the name Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, he organized volunteers by the name of Khudai Khidmatgars, or popularly called as red shirts. They would disobey all the governmental instructions and governmental institutions. Second is Dharsana. Dharsana is famous for its salt works. Now in Dharsana, Sarojini Naidu, Imam Sahib and Gandhiji's son Manilal Gandhi took up unfinished task of leading a raid on Dharsana salt works. Next is Manipur and Nagaland, or rather the northeastern parts of the country. This instance was the first instance where we come across the point where leaders or freedom fighters from northeast parts of the country took part in the freedom struggle. The most famous personality was Rani Gai Din Liu of Nagaland, who raised a banner of revolt against the governmental instructions and governmental institutions. Talking about the extent of mass participation in the movement, all sections of the population, namely women, peasants, students and others, took part in the movement. However, at the end of the movement, or rather we can call it a reason of its subsidence, there was a Gandhi-Earvin Pact. Gandhiji on the side of Indians and Lord Earvin was the viceroy on the side of the Britishers. The pact provided that the Congress would call off its civil disobedience movement and the government on its behalf or on its part would do certain actions such as releasing political prisoners, taking the governmental functionaries or officials who had resigned as part of the civil disobedience movement, returning lands of people which have been confiscated and others. So the Gandhi-Earvin Pact provided that the civil disobedience movement be come to a knot. After the civil disobedience movement, since the people were demanding for more and more constitutional reforms, a Government of India Act 1935 was passed. This was one of the biggest constitutional reforms that was passed by the Britishers for betterment of administration, or rather streamlining of administration in India. The Government of India Act is so important that certain features of this act have still been preserved by the constitution of our present times. We'll discuss the main features of Government of India Act 1935. Firstly, an All India Federation which would comprise of all British Indian provinces, all the chief commissioner provinces and the Indian states which were headed by princes or the princely states. At the federal level or the central level, the subjects were to be administered and divided into reserved and transferred subjects. These reserved subjects would be kept by the viceroy and the transferred subjects would be given to Indian ministers who would be responsible to the Central Legislative Assembly. So some kind of means of devolution of powers to the Indians had been started here. The Governor General of the country would be the pivot of all administration in the country. At the center again, a bicameral legislature was provided, a lower house and an upper house. It is quite similar in today's time as well, where we have or we are following a bicameral system of legislation. Coming to the provincial levels, what we discussed earlier was at the central or at the federal level. Now talking about the provincial level. Firstly, there was, or rather in the earlier times, there was diarchy. Now there would be autonomy. Autonomy in those subjects which were to be given to the states. That means certain subjects would now be administered by the states in full extent. Provinces were granted a separate legal identity also. Governor at the level of the state was the Crown's nominee, the nominee of the British Queen or the King at that point in time. And he would exercise authority on the King's behalf in a particular province. All the members would be directly elected. In our earlier stages, we had indirect elections. Now the elections would be direct elections. To conduct those direct elections, franchisee was extended, which included from now on women to be as voters, and ministers were made answerable to and removable by an adverse vote of the legislature henceforth. These were the main features of the Government of India Act, and I repeat that some features of this act are still being continued in our present day Indian Constitution. So friends, this was about the intervening period which included the non-cooperation movement, the civil disobedience movement, and Nehru Report, as well as the Government of India Act 1935. Thank you.